original story narrated exclusively for Love Written in Silence. Lady Helena Ashworth stands alone at the edge of a crowded ballroom, her gloved fingers pressed against the stem of a crystal glass she has not sipped from in nearly an hour. The chandeliers above cast soft golden light across her pale shoulders, but her gaze is fixed on the tall windows where frost has begun to gather at the corners of the glass. She has learned to hold her composure in rooms like this, where every smile is measured and every word carries the weight of calculation. But tonight, something in the air unsettles her. Perhaps it is the scent of hothouse roses, too sweet and out of season. Perhaps it is the way the musicians play their waltzes just a touch too slowly, as though time itself has grown reluctant. Or perhaps it is the whisper that has just begun to move through the room like wind through tall grass. The Duke of Ravenscroft has arrived. Helena's breath catches. She does not turn. She will not give him the satisfaction of acknowledgement. But her heart, traitorous and unguarded, begins to beat faster. The winter ball at Hartley Manor was an occasion of considerable importance. Families of standing had traveled from across 3 counties to attend. Their carriages lined along the gravel drive, like a procession of polished beetles. Inside, the great hall had been transformed. Candles burned in silver sconces along the walls. The air was thick with perfume and the rustle of silk. A quartet played from a raised platform near the far end of the room, their music weaving through the murmur of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. Helena had arrived with her uncle and his family. She had greeted the hosts with the proper degree of warmth. She had accepted a glass of champagne she did not want. She had allowed herself to be introduced to a young baronet, whose name she forgot almost immediately. And then, as soon as courtesy permitted, she had withdrawn to the periphery of the room. She preferred it here, the edges, the margins, the places where one could observe without being observed too closely. Helena was 31 years old. She was neither a debutante nor a widow. She occupied that peculiar space reserved for women who had not married young and who had no particular urgency to marry now. Her family was respectable, but not wealthy. Her dowry was modest. Her prospects, as her uncle frequently reminded her, were diminishing with each passing season. She did not disagree with him. She simply no longer cared. There had been a time when she had believed in the possibility of something more. A time when she had imagined that affection might matter as much as alliance, that a man might value her thoughts as much as her lineage, that she might be chosen, not acquired. But that time had passed. 3 years had passed, to be precise. 3 years since she had allowed herself to hope. 3 years since she had been made to understand that hope, in her world, was a luxury afforded only to those with the means to indulge it. Helena lifted her glass to her lips and set it down again without drinking. The champagne had gone flat. Across the room, a woman laughed too loudly. A man in a scarlet waistcoat gestured broadly, nearly striking a footman, carrying a tray of canapes. The musicians finished one waltz and began another. The room turned and turned, a slow wheel of faces and voices, and the endless performance of civility. Helena closed her eyes briefly. She wished she were home. She wished she were anywhere but here. And then the murmur began. It started near the entrance. A shift in the current of conversation. A pause. A turning of heads. Helena opened her eyes. She did not need to look to know what had caused it. She had heard that particular quality of whisper before, the mix of admiration and caution, the way people adjusted their posture when someone of real consequence entered a room. The Duke of Ravenscroft had arrived. Helena did not turn toward the entrance. She kept her gaze fixed on the windows, on the frost gathering at the edges of the glass, on the dark shapes of the trees beyond the terrace. But she was aware of him. She could not help but be aware of him. The room seemed to contract around his presence. Conversations shifted. Groups rearranged themselves. Matrons nudged their daughters forward. Gentlemen straightened their cravats. Duke Gideon Ravenscroft was a man of considerable influence. He held estates in 3 counties. He sat in the House of Lords. He was known for his principles, his discipline, and his refusal to be swayed by flattery or fashion. He had a reputation for fairness, for moral clarity, for the kind of quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. He was also, Helena knew. A man who had once sought her company with what had seemed like genuine interest. And then, without explanation, he had withdrawn. She had not seen him in 3 years. She had heard of him, of course. It was impossible not to. His name appeared in the papers. His opinions were quoted in drawing rooms. His political alliances were the subject of endless speculation. He had not written to her. He had not called. He had not offered any explanation for his sudden and complete absence from her life. Helena had told herself it did not matter. She had told herself that she had misread his intentions, that she had been foolish to imagine there had been anything more than polite conversation between them, that men like him did not form attachments to women like her. She had told herself these things until she almost believed them. Almost. Now, as the murmur of his arrival moved through the room like a wave, Helena felt something tighten in her chest. It was not longing. It was not hope. It was something harder and sharper and more dangerous. It was anger. She set her glass down on a nearby table. She smoothed the front of her gown. She would not allow him to see that his presence affected her. She would not give him that power. But even as she made this resolution, she felt the air shift. He was moving through the room. She could track his progress by the way people parted before him, by the way voices rose and fell in his wake. He was coming closer. Helena's hands tightened into fists at her sides. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to keep her expression calm, to maintain the mask she had perfected over years of navigating rooms like this. And then he was there. Not directly in front of her. Not yet. But near enough that she could sense him. Near enough that the space between them felt charged, deliberate, impossible to ignore. She did not turn. She would not turn. But then he spoke. Lady Helena. His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to command attention. She closed her eyes for the briefest moment. Then she turned. He stood perhaps 3 feet away, too close for casual acquaintance, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver beginning to thread through the dark hair at his temples. He was dressed simply in black and white, without ornament or affectation. He did not need it. His gaze was fixed on her, not with the idle curiosity of a man surveying a ballroom, but with the kind of focus that made the rest of the room fall away. Helena inclined her head. Your Grace. Her voice was cool, polite, perfectly controlled. He took a step closer. The air between them seemed to thicken. She could feel the warmth of him, the subtle disruption of space, the way his presence pressed against her composure, like a hand against glass. She lifted her chin. You're standing too close. The words came out quietly, but they were not a question. He did not move back. Instead, his mouth curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile, not amusement, something else, something that made her pulse quicken despite herself. And yet you haven't stepped back, my lady. Helena's breath caught. She hated that he was right. She hated that she had not moved, that she was standing here, rooted to the floor, as though some part of her had been waiting for this moment, even as the rest of her had spent 3 years trying to forget it. She forced herself to meet his gaze. Perhaps I am simply too polite to cause a scene. Or perhaps, he said quietly, you are curious. Curious about what? About why I am here. Helena's jaw tightened. I assume you were invited. I was. Then I see no mystery. He studied her for a long moment. The noise of the ballroom continued around them, but it felt distant, muted, as though they were standing inside a bubble of silence. You have every right to be angry with me, he said at last. Helena's hands clenched at her sides. I am not angry with you, Your Grace. I am indifferent to you. It was a lie. They both knew it. But he did not challenge her. Instead, he inclined his head slightly. Then I will not trouble you further. He took a step back. The space between them opened again, and Helena felt something inside her twist painfully. She should have been relieved. She should have been glad to see him go. But instead, she felt the loss of his proximity like a cold wind. He turned as though to walk away, and then he paused. For what it is worth, he said, his voice so low that only she could hear it. I have thought of you every day for 3 years. And then he was gone, moving back into the crowd, leaving Helena standing alone at the edge of the room with her heart pounding and her composure in ruins. Helena did not move for several minutes. She stood where he had left her, her gaze fixed on nothing, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. She had thought she was prepared for this. She had thought that 3 years would be enough time to build walls high enough and thick enough to protect herself from whatever remained of the feelings she had once harbored for him. But she had been wrong. The memories came flooding back, unbidden and unwelcome. They had met at a dinner party, a small gathering at the home of a mutual acquaintance. Helena had been seated beside him, and she had expected the usual polite conversation, the weather, the season, the quality of the wine. Instead, he had asked her opinion on a recent parliamentary debate about educational reform. She had been so surprised that she had answered honestly. She had told him that she believed education should be accessible to all children, regardless of class or gender, that the current system perpetuated inequality and wasted potential. She had expected him to dismiss her, to smile indulgently and change the subject. Instead, he had leaned forward, his expression intent, and said, "Go on." They had talked for nearly an hour. About education, about art, about the role of government in shaping society. He had challenged her ideas, but not condescendingly. He had listened. He had responded with arguments of his own, thoughtful and well-reasoned, and he had treated her not as a decoration, but as an intellectual equal. It had been intoxicating. Over the following months, they had encountered each other at other gatherings. He had sought her out. He had engaged her in conversation. He had recommended books to her, and she had read them and discussed them with him. He had invited her to view a private collection of paintings at his estate, and she had gone, accompanied by her aunt, and they had spent an entire afternoon walking through galleries, debating the merits of different schools of art. She had begun to believe that he saw her, not as a potential alliance or a convenient match, but as a person, as someone worth knowing. And then, without warning, it had stopped. He had stopped calling, stopped writing, stopped attending the events where he might have encountered her. At first, she had told herself he was busy, that his duties had taken him elsewhere, that there was some reasonable explanation. But weeks became months, and the silence continued. She had heard rumors that he was being pressured to marry, that his family was in financial difficulty, that he was negotiating a match with a wealthy heiress from the north. She had told herself it did not matter, that she had no claim on him, that whatever she had imagined between them had been nothing more than her own foolish hope. But it had mattered. It had mattered more than she wanted to admit. She had felt discarded, used, as though she had been interesting enough to pass the time with, but not valuable enough to pursue. And now, after 3 years of silence, he had reappeared. He had stood too close. He had looked at her with that same intensity. He had said he had thought of her every day. Helena closed her eyes and pressed a hand to her chest, as though she could physically hold herself together. She did not know what to believe. She did not know whether to be angry or hurt, or something else entirely. All she knew was that the walls she had built were not as strong as she had thought. The evening continued. Helena moved through it mechanically, exchanging pleasantries with people whose names she barely registered. She danced once, with a gentleman who spoke at length about his hunting dogs. She accepted a second glass of champagne and sipped it slowly, hoping it would dull the sharp edges of her thoughts. But she was aware, always, of where Gideon was in the room. She did not look at him directly, but she could track his movements by the way the crowd shifted around him, by the sound of his voice, low and steady, cutting through the chatter, by the way her own pulse quickened whenever he came near. It was maddening. She was standing near the refreshment table, pretending to examine a tray of pastries, when a small group formed nearby. A young gentleman, perhaps 25, with fair hair and an eager expression, was holding forth on some topic or another. Helena was not paying attention until she heard her own name. Lady Helena would be a prudent acquisition for any man seeking to secure his estate's future, the young man said, his tone light as though he were discussing livestock. She is well-bred, well-mannered, and unlikely to cause trouble. A sensible choice, really. Helena's hand tightened around her glass. She kept her expression neutral, but something inside her went cold. She had heard such remarks before. She had learned to ignore them, to smile politely and change the subject, to pretend that being discussed as though she were a piece of property did not wound her. But tonight, after everything, she found she did not have the strength to pretend. She opened her mouth to respond, though she was not sure what she would say. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the conversation. "A woman is not a debt to be settled." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of absolute conviction. The group fell silent, heads turned. Gideon stood a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the young man who had spoken. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made the younger man take a step back. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," the young man stammered. "I meant no offense." "Then you should choose your words more carefully," Gideon said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the space around them. "Lady Helena is not an acquisition. She is not a means to an end. She is a person of intelligence, dignity, and considerable worth, and any man who cannot see that is not worthy of her consideration." The silence that followed was absolute. Helena felt her breath catch in her throat. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, on Gideon, on the space between them. The young man flushed scarlet. He muttered something that might have been an apology, and retreated quickly. The group began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. But Helena saw the way a matron's smile had frozen, the way a political ally of Gideon's had stiffened, his expression disapproving, the way whispers began to spread, rippling outward like waves from a stone dropped into still water. Gideon had drawn a line, in public, in front of witnesses, and it had cost him. Helena's heart was pounding. She did not know what to say. She did not know what to feel. Gideon turned toward her. For a moment, their eyes met, and in that moment she saw something she had not expected. Not pride, not satisfaction, but vulnerability. He inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging something unspoken between them, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Helena stood frozen, her mind reeling. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to wonder if she had been wrong about him. The ball dragged on. Helena endured it. She danced when required. She smiled when expected. She maintained the appearance of composure, even as her thoughts churned. But as the evening drew toward its close, she found she could not remain in that crowded room any longer. The air was too warm, the noise too loud, the press of bodies too suffocating. She slipped away, moving through a side door and into one of the quieter corridors that led toward the back of the house. The noise of the ballroom faded behind her, replaced by the soft creak of floorboards and the distant sound of servants clearing away dishes. Helena walked slowly, trailing her fingers along the polished wood of the paneling. She did not have a destination in mind. She simply needed space, silence, room to breathe. She found herself drawn toward a door at the end of the corridor. She knew where it led. She had been to Hartley Manor before years ago, and she remembered the library, a small, beautiful room with tall windows and shelves lined with leather-bound volumes. She opened the door and stepped inside. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the windows. The air smelled of old paper and wood polish. It was peaceful, quiet, exactly what she needed. Helena crossed to one of the windows and stood looking out at the dark shapes of the garden beyond. Frost glittered on the grass. The trees were bare, their branches etched against the sky like ink on parchment. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. "I did not mean to drive you from the ballroom." Helena's eyes flew open. She spun around. Gideon stood near the door. She had not heard him enter. He was still dressed in his evening clothes, but his cravat was slightly loosened, and there was a weariness in his posture that she had not seen before. "You did not drive me anywhere," Helena said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I left of my own accord." "Nonetheless," he said quietly, "I apologize if my words caused you discomfort." Helena stared at him. "Your words." He took a step closer, though he kept a careful distance between them. "I should not have spoken as I did. It was not my place." "Not your place?" Helena's voice rose despite herself. "You defended me. You spoke on my behalf when no one else would. And now you apologize for it." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I do not regret what I said, but I know it may have caused you embarrassment." "That was not my intention." "I was not embarrassed," Helena said. Her hands were shaking. She clenched them into fists at her sides. I was. She could not finish the sentence. She did not have the words. Gideon watched her, his expression unreadable. And then slowly, he crossed the room until he stood before her. You were what? He asked softly. Helena looked up at him. The moonlight cast shadows across his face, but she could see his eyes, clear and steady, and utterly focused on her. I was confused, she said at last. You disappeared from my life, without explanation. For 3 years, I heard nothing from you. And now you return, and you speak as though I matter to you. But I do not understand why. I do not understand any of it. Gideon was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough. You matter to me more than you know. Then why did you leave? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. He closed his eyes briefly, as though the question pained him. When he opened them again, there was something raw in his expression. Because I had no choice. Helena shook her head. That is not an answer. It is the only answer I can give you, he said. Not here, not now. But I swear to you, Helena, I did not leave because I wanted to. I left because it was the only honorable thing I could do. Helena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. Honor, she said bitterly. What does honor have to do with abandoning someone without a word? Everything, Gideon said. And there was such conviction in his voice that Helena fell silent. They stood there, facing each other in the darkened library, the weight of 3 years of silence pressing down on them. I cannot explain it to you here, Gideon said at last. But if you will allow me, I will tell you everything. Tomorrow, when the house is quiet and we can speak without interruption. Helena wanted to refuse. She wanted to walk away and leave him standing there, just as he had left her 3 years ago. But she could not. Because despite everything, despite the hurt and the anger and the confusion, she still wanted to know. She still needed to understand. Very well, she said quietly. Tomorrow. Gideon inclined his head. Thank you. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. For what it is worth, he said without looking back, I have regretted every day of those 3 years, and I would give anything to undo the pain I caused you. And then he was gone, leaving Helena alone in the library with her heart pounding, and her mind full of questions she did not yet have answers to. Helena did not return to the ballroom. She found a maid and asked to be shown to the guest room that had been prepared for her. She pleaded a headache, which was not entirely untrue, and retired for the night. But she did not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every word, every glance, every moment of the evening. She thought of the way Gideon had defended her, the way he had looked at her, the way his voice had roughened when he said her name. She thought of the 3 years of silence, the hurt, the confusion, the way she had convinced herself that she meant nothing to him. And she thought of what he had said, that he had no choice, that it was a matter of honor. What could possibly have driven him away? What circumstance could have been so dire that he had chosen silence over honesty? Helena turned onto her side, pulling the blankets up around her shoulders. The room was cold. The fire in the grate had burned down to embers. She closed her eyes and tried to quiet her thoughts. But sleep did not come easily. And when it finally did, her dreams were full of shadows and unanswered questions. Morning came slowly. Helena woke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the curtains. She lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house beginning to stir. Footsteps in the corridor, the distant clatter of dishes, the low murmur of voices. She rose and dressed with the help of a maid who appeared at her door with a pitcher of warm water and a tray of tea. She chose a simple gown of dark blue wool, suitable for morning. She pinned her hair back in a neat chignon. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and saw a woman who appeared calm and composed. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. She left her room and made her way downstairs. The house was quiet. Most of the guests were still asleep, recovering from the late night. A few early risers were gathered in the breakfast room, speaking in low tones over plates of eggs and toast. Helena accepted a cup of tea, but did not eat. Her stomach was too unsettled. She found herself drawn, once again, toward the library. She told herself it was because she wanted a quiet place to sit, a place where she would not be disturbed. But she knew the truth. She was hoping he would be there. She opened the door and stepped inside. The room was flooded with light. The tall windows faced east, and the morning sun poured through them, turning the dust motes in the air to gold. The shelves of books glowed in the soft light. The room felt warm, peaceful, almost sacred. And Gideon was there. He stood near one of the windows, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the garden beyond. He was dressed more casually than he had been the night before, in a simple coat and waistcoat, without the formality of evening dress. He turned as she entered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I hoped you would come," he said at last. Helena closed the door behind her. "You said you would explain." "I did." He gestured toward a pair of chairs near the fireplace. Helena hesitated, then crossed the room and sat. Gideon took the chair opposite her, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. He looked tired. There were shadows under his eyes, as though he had not slept any more than she had. 3 years ago, he began, his voice low and steady, I discovered something I had not known. A legal entailment. A clause buried in old family agreements that dated back 2 generations. Helena frowned. What kind of clause? One that allowed both our families to arrange a marriage between us, as a solution to mounting debts. Helena's breath caught. What? Gideon's jaw tightened. My father had entered into an agreement with your grandfather years before either of us was born. It was meant as a safeguard, a way to consolidate resources if either family fell into financial difficulty. The clause was legal, binding, and it gave both families the right to enforce a marriage between us, if certain conditions were met. Helena stared at him, her mind reeling. I knew nothing of this. Neither did I, Gideon said. Not until my solicitor uncovered it, while reviewing the estate accounts. By that time, your family's debts had reached a point where the clause could have been invoked. Helena felt cold. So you could have forced me to marry you. Yes, the word hung in the air between them. But I did not, Gideon continued. I spent the better part of 6 months negotiating with my own family, and with your uncle, to have the clause annulled. It cost me, politically, financially. I had to call in favors. I had to make concessions. I strained relationships that had taken years to build. Helena's hands were trembling. She pressed them together in her lap. Why did you not tell me? Because telling you would have exposed your family's vulnerability, Gideon said. It would have forced you into a position of gratitude or obligation, and I did not want that. I did not want you to feel as though you owed me anything. I wanted you to be free. So you chose silence, Helena said, her voice shaking. You chose to let me believe that you had simply lost interest, that I had meant nothing to you. I thought it was the right choice, Gideon said quietly. I thought that if I withdrew, you would move on, that you would find someone else, someone who could offer you a choice, not a contract. And did it not occur to you, Helena said, her voice rising, that I might have wanted a choice in that matter as well? That I might have wanted to know the truth? Gideon looked down at his hands. I was trying to protect you. You were trying to protect yourself, Helena said. The words came out sharper than she intended, but she did not take them back. You made a decision for me, without consulting me, without giving me the chance to decide for myself what I wanted. Gideon looked up at her, and she saw the pain in his eyes. You are right, he said. I should have told you. I should have trusted you with the truth. But I was afraid. Afraid of what? That you would feel obligated to accept me, he said. That you would marry me out of duty or gratitude, not because you wanted to. And I could not bear that. I would rather have lost you entirely than won you by such means. Helena felt tears spill over, hot and unbidden. She brushed them away angrily. You did lose me, she said. For 3 years, I believed I was not enough, that I had been foolish to hope, that I meant nothing to you. You meant everything to me, Gideon said, his voice breaking. You still do. Helena closed her eyes. The words she had longed to hear. The words that should have brought her comfort. But all she felt was the weight of 3 years of silence. 3 years of pain. 3 years of believing herself unwanted. I do not know if that is enough, she said quietly. Gideon nodded slowly. I understand. They sat in silence for a long moment. The sunlight continued to pour through the windows, warm and golden. But Helena felt cold. I will not ask you to forgive me, Gideon said at last. I do not deserve it. But I want you to know that I have thought of you every day, that I have regretted my silence every moment, and that if I could go back and make a different choice, I would. Helena opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him. At the lines of weariness in his face, at the way his hands were clenched together, at the vulnerability in his eyes. He had made a mistake, a terrible, painful mistake. But he had made it out of a desire to protect her, to give her freedom, to ensure that she was not trapped by the same forces that had trapped so many women before her. It did not erase the hurt, but it changed it. It gave it context. It made it something she could begin, perhaps, to understand. "I need time," she said quietly. "I will give you all the time you need," Gideon said. Helena nodded. She rose from her chair, her legs unsteady. She moved toward the door. But before she reached it, she paused. She turned back to look at him. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me the truth." Gideon rose as well. "Thank you for listening." Helena opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. She closed it softly behind her and stood for a moment, her hand still on the handle, her heart pounding. The truth had not healed her, but it had given her something she had not had before, understanding, and perhaps, in time, that would be enough. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Helena avoided the other guests as much as possible. She took a walk in the garden, though the air was cold and her breath misted in front of her. She found a quiet corner of the drawing room and pretended to read a book, though she could not have said what it was about. Her mind was full of Gideon's words, full of the weight of what he had told her, full of the implications of what it meant. He had chosen her freedom over his own desire. He had sacrificed his own happiness to ensure that she would not be trapped. It was, she realized, the most profound act of respect she had ever received. But it was also the source of so much pain, because he had not trusted her with the truth. He had made the decision alone. He had assumed that he knew what was best for her, and that, more than anything, was what hurt. She did not want to be protected. She wanted to be trusted. She wanted to be seen as capable of making her own choices, even difficult ones. She wanted to be an equal. As the afternoon wore on, the guests began to depart. Carriages were brought around. Farewells were exchanged. The house began to empty. Helena's uncle found her in the drawing room and informed her that they would be leaving within the hour. She nodded and went to gather her things. But as she was descending the stairs, her small traveling case in hand, she saw Gideon standing in the entrance hall. He was speaking with the host, thanking him for his hospitality, but his gaze flicked toward her as she came down the stairs, and their eyes met. Helena paused. For a moment, the noise of the hall faded. It was just the two of them, standing on opposite sides of a space that felt both vast and impossibly small. Gideon inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect. Helena returned the gesture, and then she continued down the stairs and out into the cold afternoon air. The days that followed were strange. Helena returned to her uncle's house and resumed her usual routines. She took walks, she read, she attended to correspondence. She helped her aunt with household matters. But her mind was elsewhere. She thought of Gideon constantly, of the way he had looked at her, of the things he had said, of the choice he had made. She thought of the 3 years of silence, of the pain she had carried, of the way she had convinced herself that she was not enough. And she thought of what it meant to forgive. Forgiveness, she realized, was not the same as forgetting. It did not erase the hurt. It did not undo the damage. But it did allow for the possibility of moving forward. A week after the ball, a letter arrived. Helena recognized the handwriting immediately. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The letter was brief. Gideon wrote that he did not expect a response. He wrote that he understood if she wished to sever all contact. But he wanted her to know that he would be in London for the next month, attending to parliamentary business. And if she wished to speak with him, he would make himself available at her convenience. Helena read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk. She did not respond immediately. She needed time to think, to decide what she wanted. But 2 weeks later, she found herself sitting at that same desk, pen in hand, composing a reply. She wrote that she would be in London the following week. She wrote that she would be willing to meet with him, if he was still available. She did not write that she had forgiven him. She was not sure she had, but she wrote that she was willing to try. They met in a small, quiet park near the center of the city. It was late afternoon. The light was soft and golden, filtering through the bare branches of the trees. A few other people strolled along the paths, but the park was not crowded. Helena arrived first. She stood near a bench, her hands clasped in front of her, her heart pounding. And then she saw him, walking toward her with that same steady, deliberate gait. He was dressed simply, in a dark coat and hat. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. He stopped a few feet away. "Thank you for coming." "I almost did not," Helena said honestly. "I would not have blamed you." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Gideon gestured toward the bench. "May we sit?" Helena nodded. They sat side by side, leaving a careful distance between them. "I have been thinking," Helena said after a moment, "about what you told me, about the choice you made." Gideon said nothing. He simply waited. "I understand why you did it," Helena continued. "I understand that you were trying to protect me, to give me freedom, and I'm grateful for that. But," Gideon prompted gently, "but I wish you had trusted me," Helena said. "I wish you had told me the truth and let me decide for myself what I wanted. Because by making the choice alone, you took away my agency, just as surely as that contract would have." Gideon closed his eyes briefly. "You are right," he said. "I see that now. I thought I was honoring you by sparing you the burden of that knowledge. But in doing so, I dishonored you. I treated you as though you were not strong enough to bear the truth. And that was wrong." Helena looked at him, at the lines of regret in his face, at the way his hands were clenched together in his lap. "I do not know if I can forgive you," she said quietly. "Not yet. The hurt is still too fresh. But I want to try. I want to see if we can build something new. Something honest. Something based on mutual respect, not on secrets or silence." Gideon turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw hope, fragile and tentative, but real. "I would like that," he said, "more than anything." Helena nodded. "Then we will take it slowly, one step at a time, and we will be honest with each other. No more secrets." "No more secrets," Gideon agreed. They sat together on that bench as the afternoon light faded into evening. They did not speak much, but the silence between them was different now, not heavy or painful, but peaceful. And when they finally rose to leave, Gideon offered her his arm. Helena hesitated for only a moment before taking it. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a beginning. Over the following weeks, they met regularly, sometimes in parks, sometimes in quiet tea rooms, sometimes in galleries or libraries where they could talk without interruption. They spoke of many things, of books and art and politics, of their childhoods and their hopes and their fears, of the mistakes they had made and the lessons they had learned. And slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild what had been broken. It was not easy. There were moments when the old hurt resurfaced, moments when Helena felt the sting of those 3 years of silence, moments when Gideon's regret threatened to overwhelm him. But they did not run from those moments. They faced them together. They spoke honestly about their feelings. They gave each other grace. And gradually, the trust began to grow. One evening, as they walked together through a quiet street near Helena's lodgings, Gideon stopped suddenly. "There is something I need to say," he said. Helena turned to face him. "What is it?" "I love you," Gideon said. His voice was steady, but there was vulnerability in his eyes. "I have loved you since the first time we spoke, and I will love you for the rest of my life. But I do not expect you to say it back. I do not expect anything from you. I simply needed you to know." Helena felt her breath catch. She looked at him, standing there in the fading light, his heart laid bare before her, and she realized that she believed him. Not because he had said the words, but because he had shown her, in his actions, in his honesty, in his willingness to give her time and space, and the freedom to choose. "I do not know if I am ready to say it back," she said quietly, "but I think I could be. In time." Gideon smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but it was genuine. "That is enough," he said. "That is more than enough." They continued walking, side by side, their hands brushing occasionally, but not quite touching, and Helena felt something inside her begin to shift. The walls she had built around her heart were still there, but they were no longer impenetrable. She was beginning to believe, once again, in the possibility of something more. Spring came slowly to London. The trees began to bud. The air grew warmer. The city seemed to shake off the weight of winter and come alive again. Helena and Gideon continued to meet. Their conversations grew deeper. Their silences grew more comfortable. The distance between them grew smaller. And one morning, as they stood together in a quiet garden where the first flowers were beginning to bloom, Helena realized that she was happy, not in the giddy, breathless way of youth, but in the quiet, steady way of someone who has been through pain and come out the other side. "I have been thinking," she said, turning to face Gideon. "About what?" he asked. "About us," she said. "About what we are building. And I think I am ready." "Ready for what?" Helena took a deep breath. "Ready to trust you. Ready to believe that this is real. Ready to say that I love you." Gideon's eyes widened. For a moment, he simply stared at her, as though he could not quite believe what he had heard. And then slowly he smiled. It was the most beautiful smile Helena had ever seen. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "how long I have waited to hear you say that." "I think I do," Helena said. He reached out and took her hand. This time, she did not pull away. They stood together in that garden, surrounded by the promise of spring, and for the first time in 3 years, Helena felt whole. The weeks that followed were filled with a kind of quiet joy that Helena had never known before. She and Gideon made no grand announcements. They did not rush toward any particular destination. They simply allowed themselves to be together, to enjoy each other's company, to build a life based on honesty and mutual respect. But eventually, the question of the future had to be addressed. One evening, as they sat together in the library of Gideon's London residence, he turned to her with a serious expression. "I want to ask you something," he said, "but I want you to know that you are free to say no, that there is no obligation, that I will respect whatever decision you make." Helena's heart began to beat faster. "What is it?" Gideon took her hand in his. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because of any contract or agreement, not because of duty or convenience, but because I love you, because I want to spend the rest of my life with you, because I cannot imagine a future without you in it." Helena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. But this time, they were not tears of pain. They were tears of joy. "But," Gideon continued, "I will not ask you to give up your independence. I will not ask you to be anything other than who you are. If you choose to marry me, it will be as an equal, as a partner, not as a possession." Helena looked at him, at the man who had made mistakes but had learned from them, who had hurt her but had worked to make amends, who had chosen her freedom over his own desire, and was now offering her a choice freely made. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Gideon's face lit up. He pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the world outside forgotten. And when they finally pulled apart, Gideon cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was a slow, deliberate kiss, not a claim, but a confirmation, a promise. When they broke apart, Helena was smiling. "There is one condition," she said. "Anything," Gideon said. "No more secrets," Helena said. "No more making decisions for me. If we are to be partners, then we must be honest with each other. Always." "Always," Gideon agreed. "I swear it." Helena nodded. "Then I think we will do very well together." The wedding took place in early summer. It was a small, quiet affair. Only close family and a few friends were in attendance. Helena wore a simple gown of ivory silk. Gideon wore a dark suit, and his eyes never left her face as she walked toward him. The ceremony was brief, but meaningful. They spoke their vows clearly and without hesitation, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Gideon kissed her gently, and the small gathering applauded. Afterward, there was a modest breakfast at Gideon's estate. The mood was warm and joyful. Helena's aunt wept with happiness. Gideon's younger sister, whom Helena had come to know over the past months, embraced her warmly and welcomed her to the family. And as the morning wore on, Helena found herself standing by a window, looking out at the gardens where the roses were in full bloom. Gideon came to stand beside her. He did not touch her, but she could feel his presence, warm and steady and reassuring. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. Helena turned to look at him, at the man who had become her husband, her partner, her equal. "Yes," she said. "I am." He smiled. "So am I." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sunlight play across the garden, and Helena realized that this was what she had been searching for all along. Not grand passion or sweeping romance, but this quiet, steady, honest love. This partnership built on respect and trust, and the courage to be vulnerable. It was not perfect. They would still have disagreements. They would still make mistakes. But they would face those challenges together, as equals. And that, Helena thought, was more than enough. The years that followed were good ones. Helena and Gideon settled into a life that was both comfortable and fulfilling. They divided their time between London and Gideon's country estate. They entertained friends. They supported causes they believed in. They built a life based on shared values and mutual respect. Helena found that marriage, far from confining her, had given her a kind of freedom she had never known. Gideon encouraged her interests. He valued her opinions. He treated her as an equal in all things, and she, in turn, supported him. She stood by his side as he navigated the complexities of political life. She offered counsel when he asked for it. She challenged him when she disagreed with him. And he listened. They were not always in agreement. They had their arguments, their moments of frustration, but they had learned to communicate honestly, to give each other grace, to remember that they were on the same side. And through it all, their love deepened. It was not the passionate, all-consuming love of youth. It was something quieter, steadier, more enduring. It was the kind of love that could weather storms, the kind of love that grew stronger with time. One evening, as they sat together in the library of their country home, Helena looked up from the book she was reading and found Gideon watching her. "What is it?" she asked. "I was just thinking," he said, "about how fortunate I am." Helena smiled. "Fortunate how?" "To have you," he said simply. "To have found you. To have been given a second chance." Helena set her book aside and crossed the room to sit beside him. "We were both given a second chance," she said, "and we chose to take it." Gideon took her hand in his. "I will never stop being grateful for that choice." "Neither will I," Helena said. They sat together in the warm glow of the firelight, their hands entwined, their hearts at peace. And Helena knew that this was what love was meant to be. Not a fairy tale, not a dream, but a conscious, deliberate choice, made every day. In the small moments and the large ones, in the joys and the challenges. It was a choice to stand close, to trust, to be vulnerable, to be honest. And it was a choice she would make again and again for the rest of her life. Years later, when Helena was older and her hair had begun to silver, she would sometimes think back on that winter ball, on the moment when Gideon had stood too close and she had not stepped back. She would think of the hurt and the confusion and the long road they had traveled to reach each other. And she would think of what they had built together. A life, a partnership, a love that had been tested and had endured. She would think of the grandchildren who ran through the halls of their home, filling it with laughter and noise, of the causes they had championed together, of the quiet evenings spent reading by the fire, of the conversations that had deepened with each passing year. And she would realize that the distance between two people was not measured in inches or feet. It was measured in honesty, in trust, in the willingness to be seen and to see in return. Gideon had stood too close that night, but she had not stepped back. And in that moment of proximity, everything had changed. It had not been easy. It had not been simple, but it had been worth it. Because the space between them was no longer a barrier. It was a bridge, a place where two people could meet as equals, where love could grow not in spite of their wounds, but because they had chosen to heal them together. Helena would smile when she thought of these things, and she would reach for Gideon's hand, still strong and steady after all these years, and he would take it, always, because that was what they had promised each other, to stand close, to be honest, to choose each other every day, for as long as they both lived, and they had kept that promise. In the end, that was all that mattered.